Hello. In this video, this ASMR video, I will be talking about why the opposite dimension cannot exist. So, I saw this meme just now. It's a pretty good meme, but anyway, I should probably turn the volume down on that. Anyway, this meme made me realize that the opposite dimension cannot exist. So, in the opposite dimension, everything. Let's establish a few rules. All right. So first of all, in the opposite dimension, everything is the opposite of itself. All right. Now that one makes sense. It makes sense for that to be true. Now, let's go to our next rule that branches off from this rule. Because of this rule, the "Why are you gay" meme exists in our dimension. And the opposite of existence is non-existence. Therefore, the "Why are you straight" meme does not exist in the opposite dimension. Now that also makes sense, right? Now this can be applied to anything. Now, if we assume the opposite dimension exists, that means that since the opposite dimension exists to our dimension, then in the opposite dimension cannot exist. Now there are two different ways you can take that. That means that either you can travel to the opposite dimension, but it's one way because our dimension does not exist in the opposite dimension, or it could be taken as the opposite dimension cannot exist to itself, meaning that we can observe the opposite dimension from the outside, but it does not actually exist. Now, this doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So, what's going on here? Well, opposite dimension cannot be observed because we can't travel between dimensions. Meaning in the opposite dimension, the opposite dimension can be observed. Now, we're going to take this to mean our dimension because our dimension is the opposite of the opposite dimension, except that in the opposite dimension, then the same dimension can be observed, which is the same as our dimension, which means the opposite dimension isn't the opposite dimension at all, which means that to us the opposite dimension isn't the opposite dimension, which means that in the opposite dimension must be the opposite dimension. Just throwing that out there.